My name is Max Farrar. I'm 74, um, and I am a kind of hybrid of activism, intellectualism, educationalism, culturalism, and do a lot of, I have done a lot of different jobs. And I guess the common theme throughout them has been something connecting education with thinking, with social change, with the passion really for what is nowadays called social justice across the board, whether you're talking about race, class, gender, sexual choices. Um, you know, I do think that the only hope for humanity really is to provide for a caring, nurturing, absolutely egalitarian life for people of every shape, size, interest, background. So that's what I've basically tried to do throughout my working life and my social and cultural and family life. I've always thought carefully about where I'm coming from, and I'm lucky enough to have been exposed when I was really in my early teens. Books suddenly arrived in my father was in the Air Force, and I mean he was an officer in the Air Force, and I come from what I say without really wanting to be too cruel. I say I come from the Philistine white English middle class. And I use the word Philistine because my father didn't have I mean, he was privileged. He went to a boarding school and he got his exams, but he joined the Air Force at 19 for the war. And he hadn't done well at school. My mother was also from the privileged white English middle classes, but when the school teacher said to her father, "Your daughter should really, she's talented. She should really go on and be a school teacher. I think she should go to college." My mum was very good at sports. All her family were very good at sports. PE teacher or something, and her father said, "No, of course I'm not going to waste my money on my daughter. She's going to get married and have children. That's her role." So she also was like my father, were intelligent people, but without not really being drawn in any way into further education or really any of the kind of so-called refined aspects of the English middle class culture. Um, so there were no books in our house until my mother bumped into a Liberal MP called Jeremy Thorpe in North Devon, who said, "You're a clever woman and you should be reading." And novels suddenly arrived in our house. And that helped me to think. Literature is clearly a great way of thinking about other people, but also thinking about yourself. And I'm probably one of millions who are very affected by J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, because it's a misfit, unhappy, middle-class boy trying to get out of the rut of his class and gender situation. So that has always motivated me to try and find out more. And the other formative influence really was being at this boarding school and beginning to read about civil rights and having a black friend at that school. And that led us to read the Sunday Times, actually. On a Sunday, there would always be something about Black America, and that exposed me to the writings of James Baldwin. And because I thought I might be in love with this black boy, I read Giovanni's Room and realized that I loved him, but I didn't fancy him. So it wasn't a kind of sexual love that it was very, very helpful at 14, 15 to read a book about actually, I always thought, until I reread it recently, I always thought one of the characters in Giovanni's Room was black. I just always thought, and I've read it, of course, it's actually Baldwin just putting himself in the bodies of two white men, and it's an absolutely exquisite book. Um, so I was able to use literature and friendships to reflect on my situation. And later, I thought a lot more about my father's background, because my father was, until he retired from the Air Force, was a very sort of standard, rather um, very socially skilled, but very unemotionally, not good at talking about his emotional life, not good at talking about the sort of, and he certainly didn't have a great deal of education, so the kind of cultural things that I was interested in weren't part of his way of living and way of thinking. He liked sailing boats, and when he retired, he liked cooking. Well, all good things. But he was born in the Raj in India. He was born in rural Pindi, now Pakistan, but it was India when he was there. Again into the military. His father was in the army, but his father had stayed in India and trained racehorses for the Indian elite. And I remember being fantastically, um, it had a wonderful emotional effect on me when my mother said, probably in her 70s, probably shortly after my father had died, actually, he apparently said the only people who ever loved me were the Indian servants. And I thought that's why he, for all his middle class white privilege, our house always had black Air Force people, black Nation Air Force people coming into the house. And I had the great advantage, therefore, of that being not, there was no question how exotic they were or how interesting they were. They were just people in the Air Force coming in from other countries, the Commonwealth Air Force, basically, coming and going. And that was all very just sort of taken for granted. So I'm incredibly grateful to the fact that my father had clearly recognized as a child that it didn't matter what you looked like. It was, it's who you were. And CLR James on CLR James's gravestone. I've been to it in Trinidad. It's just a marvelous statement which says, he as a Trinidadian Marxist intellectual, sometime in the 1930s, actually probably in Britain when he comes to do the cricket writing and things in Lancashire. James said that we came to realize that it's not where you come from, it's where you're going to that counts. And as soon as you get that sort of insight, you realize that, these divisions, these terribly impacted divisions in our society on race or class or your culture and your religion and all the things that we try and sediment people, stick people into these sorts of boxes and think that you can predict what kind of a person they're going to be, or think you can control their life chances, and you build a society which does put people in boxes and close the door on them. As soon as you begin to get out of that way of thinking, and you then have to continually think about how you and I have to think about this all the time. I am part of that the white privileged middle classes, and I've always been given all those advantages, and sort of undoing them is part of my thing. The word ally is a word that I'm happy to embrace. It always seems a little kind of probably too kind, really, because I am very aware that back in the day, and we're thinking now about the early 70s when I first began to live in the Chapeltown area, the area in Leeds of multicultural settlement, from in the post-war period. Uh, I first lived in Chapeltown in 1970 as a third-year student, and I had the marvelous experience of revising for my finals, overlooking a street in the centre of Chapeltown called Spencer Place, and seeing a Black Power demonstration going past. So I stopped. This would be the summer of 1971. So I put down my books and run out into the street and follow the demonstration round at a distance, because I've never come across a Black Power demo in Leeds. I'd been to Speaker's Corner and seen the Black Power people as a teenager when I lived in Hemel Hempstead. So I was familiar with Black Power, and I was fascinated to suddenly see it arriving literally on my doorstep in Leeds. So I followed them around, and we go into actually what was then called the Jubilee Hall, which is the Jewish community had settled this area prior to the becoming more ethnically diverse. Um, the Jubilee Hall was the Jewish community centre, community hall. And I soon found out a couple of years later that there was Darcus Howe and Barbara Bees and the Black Panthers from London, and it was a fiery speech, and I'm totally mesmerized and and impressed by what I'm seeing and realizing that it maps onto what I'd begun to understand about civil rights in the States and my black friend at school. So I'm just thinking Chapeltown is the place to live. So 71, I go and live with Jane, who was my girlfriend at the time. Now, I mean, amazingly decided that she would live with me for the next 50 years or so. Many people have questioned her judgment on that, but she was a Warwick University student, so I lived there for 71, 72. But she wanted to come back up north. Her family were from Barnsley in Yorkshire, so she thought she'd like to be in the north, and I wanted to come back to Leeds. So we settled again, sort of together as a couple in Chapeltown in 72. And at that point, I'm able to hook up with the existing little community newspaper called Chapeltown News and the Chapeltown Community Association. So it becomes very easy to live in a multicultural neighborhood and find straight away a group of white people, some black people, and some Asian people who are interested in what in those days was called community politics, which was mainly, and I'm absolutely committed to this day, mainly about improving the roads, improving the playgrounds, improving the housing, improving the daily life of people and the material circumstances of people. But that then, and this is the ally issue, that then makes me look around and find out that you've also got a United Caribbean Association, you've got a small but significant Indian Workers Association, you've got all the religious institutions of the area, and then I soon find out that you've got a whole series of sort of national island. There's a Barbados Association, there's a Jamaica Association, etc., etc. So I'm thinking at this point of trying to write a PhD on the Chapeltown Community Association. So I immerse myself as much as I can, and I do think this is kind of valid, and I'm glad I came to the conclusion I did at the time about this. But you had to think, as a white person in particular, you had to think all the time: who am I? How do I stand in relation to all these people? And I, being the privilege of the middle class whites is you just do think you can go and knock on anybody's door. And I knocked on lots of doors. And the black power people literally told me to F off. And when I kind of, in a probably pathetically pleading way, tried to sort of find out why, um, I wasn't called an ally, I was called a missionary. And, it wasn't Darcus Howe particularly said this on this occasion, but there were equivalents of Darcus Howe in Chapeltown, and they were saying, we've had it with you white people, coming into our neighborhoods, i.e. our islands or our countries, and telling us, what to do. And I'd say, no, 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 I'm not. I wouldn't have used the word ally, but I'd say, no, I absolutely agree that everybody has their rights to form their own associations, and I'm just trying to be in some sort of dialogue. Bugger off. We don't need it. Goodbye. And I took that very much to heart, and this is the privilege part of it, but persisted. So when we wanted to write things in Chapeltown News, and the collective was predominantly white, there were a couple of black people who were associated with them, but I mean, it's a very studenty kind of thing, producing. I mean, it's all very hand to mouth, but you had to be able to type, you had to be able to do your letrosate, you had to be able to do your paste up, you had to get it to the printers on time. It was a very studenty sort of. We're all ex-students, really, left wing, libertarian, community orientated students, and we did continually say, but look, to the United Caribbean Association, you're doing all this great stuff, and we would write about it. I would go to events. When they organised the strike of the children in the Cowper Street School, it was absolutely magical and incredibly impressive community politics. They're saying our children are being taught by racists, they're being undermined, they're not doing as well as they were doing, as we did. You know, the parents are saying we were doing far better at the same age in the Caribbean than our children are doing here. We demand a better education. People like me are gobsmacked, and I'm writing it all down. And in fact, Chapeltown News functions as a sort of diary, a sort of, it's not proper journalism. It took me a long time to learn to do proper journalism, but there it is as reportage of a community in motion demanding equal rights and justice. And Chapeltown News then opens the pages up to, if they want to contribute something that they write themselves, we then print it. So the article that's in Chapeltown News on the supplementary school that the United Caribbean Association produced, very much in line with Bernard Cord's, all the pioneering work Bernard Cord was doing about educationally, the so-called educationally subnormal schools and things. You know, it was all percolating into Leeds and Chapeltown, and I bought my copy of Bernard Cord's classic pamphlet at one of the United Caribbean Association's events, and so I could lap it all up in writing and reading. Um, and they contributed an article on the supplementary school, which stands as an important historic document. I'm still being called a missionary, but it's just getting slightly easier. And because I stay, and a few years later I work at the Hales and Chapeltown Law Centre, and we start doing much more legally based work alongside people who are trying to transform their material situations. By this time, I'm something of a Marxist, and so I'm very, very conscious that if you don't intertwine all of this with actual structural change, and you asked me about thinking in terms of the systemic problems. If you live in Chapeltown and you meet black and Asian and white European and white Scottish or white Irish or white just English white working class people, and you see the talent that's there, you see the intelligence that's there, you see the potential that's there, you can't help but think there is something wrong with a system that's holding all these people down. And, you don't have to be a Marxist, but it does help to see that these, and then you become a feminist and you see there's a structure of gender, and you become an anti-racist and you see there's a structure of racism and there's a structure of class. So I'm absorbing all this stuff, and I give up trying to write a PhD. I say to my tutor, this is ridiculous. There's no way a person like me is ever going to understand an area like this in 2 or 3 years. And it took me 27 years to write it, and I did eventually. And it's quite a decent piece of work because I spent 27 years trying to figure out what's wrong with society and how that's expressed in Chapeltown, but particularly to say the transformations that have taken place because of independent, black-led social action. I'm quietly proud of having made a bit of a contribution to the building up of people's knowledge and ability to think for themselves about the history, particularly of the migrations and settlements, and and to try and do it in this sort of fairly it's not as rich as it should be. So the book about Arthur Francis is rich about the politics, but it doesn't say an awful lot about what an emotionally challenging struggle all of this has been. And my Chapeltown book doesn't say enough, for instance, about it says a lot about politics, doesn't say anything about religion. And I became much more aware as time went on how, for an awful lot of people, religion is part of their resilience. And it's part of. I was much more aware about how art and creativity was part of the way in which you reflect, you craft a new language for what are often traumatic and emotionally fraught experiences. And obviously reggae was an eye opener to people like me in that respect, because reggae is pain and rebellion, and of course it's love and it's joy as well. But for those of us who are schooled in Bob Marley, it was all those highly political, lyrical, beautiful, emotionally rich songs became terribly significant for. It's so embarrassing. I had long hair, which I'm glad I never tried to put into locks, but I did have long hair. And I got Jane to knit me a tam, a red, and I did actually take it off quite soon afterwards. But I remember thinking, oh yeah, I just really want to be a Rasta. If only I could be a Rasta. But these little fantasies that white boys have. So the David Oluwale story um, literally pierced my heart in 1972 when I had seen. I mean, this is I keep sort of mentioning this because I think it should be thought of as art, as political art. I had seen the words "Remember Olawale" painted in huge white letters on one of the Yorkshire stone walls on Chapeltown Road. As when we came back to Leeds in the summer of 1972, there were the words "Remember Olawale," and I had heard nothing about the trial of the officers in November 1971, which wasn't that long ago. Even though actually I now see that the Guardian and the Sunday Times and all kinds of national newspapers had covered the trial of the officers who were accused of killing David Oluwale, but I just missed it somehow. But when I saw "Remember Olawale" painted on the wall, I thought, what's all that about? And the first edition of Race Today, before Darcus Howe and the collective took it over, had a very long article by a guy who I subsequently found out was a Black Power militant from Manchester, another highly educated and intelligent and creative guy called Ron Phillips. And he wrote for Race Today a very, very searing account of what he'd heard said in the trial of the officers in Leeds Crown Court in November 1971. So as soon as I read the story and saw the words, I thought, this is unbelievable. This is the kind of the lowest point of racist power being exerted against, in this case, a Nigerian working class person. And I mean, I remain almost as shocked today as I was in 1972 by this. And I did actually do little bits of. I had a job in the mid 70s at the art college, and I did general studies with art students, and we were allowed to do a kind of week's project with them on any topic we liked. These poor youngsters were subjected to a whole week of my pain about David Oluwale, because by that time, and again, to go back to the creativity thing, one of the resources that was available to me was the printed edition of the script of a radio play that another very privileged white Englishman who realized that there was something wrong with this society, a man called Jeremy Sanford, an old Etonian who had written about homelessness, effectively the Cathy Come Home kind of indictment of the way that the system was neglecting people in the housing, in the provision of housing. And so Sanford had become interested in the Olawale story. He must have read the stuff in the newspapers in 1971. He came to Leeds. He interviewed another fabulous white person, this time of Irish descent, who'd settled in Leeds and had become very friendly with lots of Caribbean women. A woman called Maureen Baker, and Maureen worked in what is sometimes rather, pejoratively called the race relations industry, but Maureen wasn't. She worked in an early version of the support services for black people, and was a campaigner in the Liberal Party, and a tremendous, became a massive friend of all the people like Arthur France and all the black militants. Maureen was part of their circle in the United Caribbean Association, but Sanford interviewed Maureen, who knew David Oluwale, and you would take him into her house. and wrote this radio play, which by 1974 I could get hold of. When you're trying to do a bit of research in those days, it wasn't like you could Google this stuff. You had to sort of search out what little printed resources you could find. So these poor students, I mean, I say poor students, they all took to it. But I now realise it was a bit of a tall order to ask 16-year-olds to read a radio play. I photocopied it, and they all had to read it and take parts. And I, took them. But one of the things that happened to David Oluwale, and it's in the court case, is that these two officers who took it upon them to persecute him would pick him up in the middle of the night, drive him out to the outskirts of Leeds, and dump him. Say, "Don't come back." David was incredibly resilient, incredibly would stood up for himself, would always walk back into Leeds. I took all these poor students out to one of the places where they dumped him on a wet, cold December dark night, and said, "Now we'll get the bus out, but you're going to walk back." I mean, they could have all got run over. It was completely outside what you could possibly do with students today. But they all did dutifully walk back. And I kept saying to them, imagine being a black working class Nigerian and having police beating you, taking you out here, and then you walking. Anyway, it's experiential learning. I'm sure it's a very good thing, and they probably did remember it. So I was always invested in this story. But to be honest, until Carol Phillips came and interviewed me, because he had seen that I'd made a quick reference to it in the Chapeltown book, which had come out in 2002. So by this time, people like Carol Phillips were, as a black man, as a black boy growing up in Leeds and knowing the story, he as a black British intellectual is revisiting his own childhood and his own memories. And of course, he writes with such sort of, I mean, quite a cool style, but such a sort of incisively, emotionally developed interrogation of all his characters. And in this case, he in the book he has a section on about Olawale. He imagined himself as a black girl walking up Chapeltown Road and bumping into Olawale. And I read this and thought how how imaginative and how creative and how powerful it was for him to put himself into somebody else's shoes, as he always does in his writing. It's incredible how gifted he is at putting himself into other people's shoes. So the motivation for the memorial for David begins with Carol Phillips's book called Foreigners, actually 3 English Lives, strongly recommended. Long section on David Oluwale, and Carol Phillips says there should be a memorial. And whilst I was at the university, I did have the opportunity to use some of the university's resources to form a David Oluwale working party. And that had people like Arthur France and Representative Dr. Hector Goma from the Nigerian Community Leeds Group and other people of migrant heritage. So we functioned as a working party for a while, but when I retired from paid work, and we didn't have the auspices of the university to rely on anymore, we formed a charity called the David Oluwale Memorial Association in 2012. So that formalized us as a charitable body and we were a company limited by guarantee. So, this brave young white man says, I want this story to be told. And to their credit, the senior police officers at that point said, yes, we will investigate. And they bring in a proper team from London to do the investigation. So there's a whole raft of things that you learn. I learned all this about 1 or 2 decent police, because we were so hostile to the police. They'd fitted us all up around bonfire night. They were so remorselessly hostile to the black community in the 70s in Leeds, and people like Arthur France were continually having to have campaigns against racist policing. So there's a long history for people like me to think slightly differently about that. You do get reform if you I mean, you have to push very hard with the police, and we're still having to push very hard with the police. But West Yorkshire Police has been partly transformed by the work that Arthur and the others, and Maureen Baker and various people did in the 70s and the 80s, and the young people rioting. I mean, that totally brought people to their senses in this city. 1975 riot, and I call them uprisings, but or or political, they're politically motivated in my view. 1975, then 81, and various smaller things later on. Those sorts of transformations come about, and we had the benefit in the Oluwale campaign of having had some change at the senior levels of West Yorkshire Police. So they have actually been supportive all along the line, because reforms do eventually take place when you've got this kind of committed community-based pressure from below, severe pressure from below. And in the Oluwale case, we also realized very early on that you'd get much more energy and much more. It's such a grim story that if you don't bring in people's the best parts of people's responses, you are just going to depress and depress and depress. So we always used the creative arts as part of our way of assembling people, using it as often with certainly people like Ian Duhigg and other accomplished poets have written poetry about it. Fine artists like Rashid Araeen produced art right away in the early 70s. And Rashid, is finally getting the recognition he's due. Linton Kwesi Johnson produces poetry in the mid and late 70s. But I absolutely believe that you engage people, you get a different way of telling a story. There's music that's been made. Leeds United fans made up songs for David Oluwale, and they were pretty racist actually, but they disliked the police so much that they took up David Oluwale's case in sort of ditties that they'd sing in the crowd, and that's now been. We've had that or Ellen Smith has re-recorded that. So there's this outpouring of creativity around David Oluwale that we've nurtured and we've enhanced. But in some cases, people have just, there's an artist in Scarborough, a painter in Scarborough, who sent us a photo of a piece of fine art that she'd done of David Oluwale, which we're delighted to use. And all the time we thought, let's not just have a sculpture, let's have a memory garden. And so right from the beginning, and in fact it's Arthur's daughter Mahalia who said, let's have something that children will like. Let's have something that families will go, wow, this is a really beautiful thing to see in David's name. And that was an idea we took up pretty well straight away, and it took us a little bit of time, but we then made our connection with Yinka Shonibari. And Yinka, we used the good services of a Leeds artist called Pippa Hale, who said, let's ask Yinka. She said, I'll warn you, Max, Yinka doesn't take commissions. This is a long shot. We'll do our best, but don't expect too much. Yinka listened to the story. We made a short pitch to him. He said, yes, I'll do this. Because Yinka too could see, this is a story of incredible, a story in which it sort of beggars belief, actually. It's the tragic element of it, but he could also see that the work we were doing, we're trying to flip the narrative. And one of the narratives we've been trying to flip is that it's not just racism at the heart of this story. If David hadn't been sent into a psychiatric hospital in 1953, if he'd just been treated as a lot of black people were getting in trouble with the law, but in his case, David was defined as psychiatrically ill. I still think it's possible he wasn't ill. Anyway, he is defined in Yorkshire, in Leeds's prison, as psychiatrically ill, and he then spends 8 years in a psychiatric hospital, and he comes out incredibly ill. Largactil and electroconvulsive therapy did mess his brain up, and his friends all said he came out a shadow of his former self, and they could not, and he was a broken, well, he wasn't completely broken in spirit, but materially he wasn't really able to hold down a job. He becomes persistently rough sleeping, and eventually the last couple of years he's absolutely destitute and permanently rough sleeping. But what we're trying to say about this is that if his mental health issues had been properly addressed in 1953, if he hadn't been just cast away as of course a lot of white people were as well, being cast away into those psychiatric hospitals and given the most repressive and unhelpful so-called treatments. And that precipitates his homelessness. So eventually you see that his plight is a kind of profound intersection of racism, of police brutality, of mental ill health, of homelessness. You know, he's turned abject, and it should be understood in its complexity. And the flipping that we're trying to do is say, here's a thing of beauty that can come out of this. We're not forgetting this abject history, and we're continually talking about the fact that so many people are still sleeping rough on our streets. There are so many people, disproportionately numbers of black and brown, particularly men, people in psychiatric hospitals. You know, these are the contemporary relevant issues, but we can also talk at the same time. And the sculpture, the Inka Shonibari sculpture, this beautiful hibiscus flower rising out of this hard, fractured landscape that surrounds it, but it's this thing of beauty is rising out of it. We can say, look, let's think of the other side of what migrant people have brought to this country.